In the last month in Australia, particularly in the second biggest city in Melbourne, they've been having real problems around African gangs. Now, there's been a few hundred of these used, and the crimes have varied from riots, assaulting police, and multiple robberies. It's been front page news for a lot of January, although it has settled down to an extent now, and it brings around those questions around refugees, immigrants, and crime. Now, recent European studies have shown the groups around asylum seekers that are the most likely to commit crimes, notably sexual assault, are asylum seekers who've just had their claims rejected. So that's the most likely group, and I guess you can see why. Now, I work in an area of Sydney where there are many people from Africa. Now, Australia, like Canada, is very multicultural. But even here, the sort of glistening black skin, the sort of towering height of Sudanese and Somalians is really quite exotic. But I think the youth crime problem among Africans is kind of the latest instalment of young people, particularly teenagers and adolescents from ethnic backgrounds, struggling to find their place. Now, particularly those from refugee or unskilled migrant groups. Now, correctional services in Australia have long held special booklets for Pacific Islanders because they're overrepresented in crime. There's also a euphemistically named Middle Eastern Crime Squad in Sydney, dealing almost exclusively with Lebanese groups. Now, like other children of Arab and Pacific Islander heritage, the Sudanese teenagers come from traditional cultures who once lived in sort of tight-knit clans bound by religion and tradition. But this rapidly disintegrates within a generation of living in Australia. Sudanese families are often led by single parents, and they'll have 7 or 8 children. Parents often don't even know their kids are in custody. The refugee experience from African countries can be especially traumatic. Now, part of the youth problems are a generational split where they feel like their parents don't really understand what it's like growing up in such a different environment such as Australia. They're also from a culture that doesn't place a big emphasis on setting strong boundaries for boys, unlike the girls who are often closely controlled. Now, these attitudes among some Africans are quite similar to many Arab families that I see. Now, we in the middle class West, we have quite a different parental attitude, and sometimes it's called helicopter parenting. We give them autonomy, but sometimes we can wrap them in a degree of cotton wool, limiting their resilience. But many cultures around the world, where the kids, boys in particular, are allowed to roam free until they're much older, and that's where the conformity comes around, say, work or who they can marry. But it doesn't always work. That parenting idea or strategy, if you like, isn't always able to be applied when they move to the urban West. Now, recent reports discovered some African parents are sending their children to boarding schools in places like Uganda to try and instill some discipline into their males. Now, youth gangs are a way of expressing a kind of emerging cultural identity away from the constrictions of sometimes quite stifling communities. And it's adolescents, teenagers who really want belonging. And just as there is a sort of jihadi street feel that some people who went to, say, Syria have in their videos, some of this gangster rap culture is also very attractive to many of the Africans because it expresses an oppositional, non-white way of expressing themselves. But you can't blame rap music. I mean, rap culture is very attractive to lots of, I guess, non-white young people who don't necessarily feel part of the white mainstream. But this is a way of still kind of expressing rebellion, which is so typical of their life stage. Now, Australians are lucky that South Sudan is the region that has a majority Christian population. It's possible if they were of Muslim descent, they could have channeled their antisocial behaviour with some terrorist leanings. Now, the reality is in Australia, we have had some recent terror-related incidents involving Africans, including a Somali youth, Mr. Ali in Melbourne, and a woman in Adelaide who was a nursing student and was accused of pledging allegiance to Islamic State. Now, like other Muslims growing up in the West, part of their problem is trying to form identity when they're caught between two cultures. Now, obviously, no question Islam can be a factor, but this difficulties in identity formation is also a critical part, especially when you link the identity politics of the West, where there's less of a coherent national identity. Now, it's unhelpful to overstate any African problem, but the reality is many of them are thriving, especially in music and sport. So, we shouldn't overstate it, but the problems around antisocial youth are real. And as well as having strong law and order, one of the key solutions, I think, is smaller families and strict boundaries with boys. I'm Tanvir Ahmed. If you like that video, subscribe to Rebel